Hello and welcome to Inside Microsoft Teams. I'm Derek Snyder. Last month at Build, we announced how developers can extend the capabilities of Microsoft 365 Copilot with plugins. So to learn more, I'm joined by Rob Howard, Partner Director of Program Management for the Microsoft 365 platform. Rob, welcome to Inside Microsoft Teams.
Hey, Derek. Thanks for having me.
I really appreciate it. So first, why don't you just give me the quick elevator pitch on what you do at Microsoft?
I work on the product management team for the Microsoft 365 platform, and we look after a few different things. One is kind of a platform unification and rationalization effort to take all the work that we've done in places like the Teams platform and the Microsoft Graph and Microsoft Identity and bring it across Microsoft 365 and kind of unify it with a bunch of developer platform technologies that we've built over the years. And a lot of that was announced at Build as well. Things like being able to take web add-ins from Outlook, Word, Excel, PowerPoint, bring them in the same package with Teams is all kind of related to that effort. And then the second part of our team works on a bunch of Microsoft 365 experiences. So we own the Microsoft 365 app and Microsoft365.com, as well as the Microsoft 365 Suite Shell, which is kind of the common user experience. People affectionately know the waffle in the upper left-hand corner for switching between apps and the app bar and the kind of shared search navigation or shared search experience in the nav header, all that kind of shell that brings together the Microsoft 365 web apps as a suite.
Wow, fantastic. So obviously the conversation I want to have with you today is really around generative AI and Copilot specifically coming to Microsoft 365 and the extensibility layer that comes with that. So I'll ask you just kind of a general question up front. What do you personally see as the most promising or interesting application of generative AI across the Microsoft 365 platform?
One of the stories that I tell people most often is I was recently working with a few colleagues on a paper about how we can change some of our practices internally for how we do product design and engineering. We did a set of focus groups on with different disciplines across Microsoft. We then got together and had a Teams meeting. That we recorded that Teams meeting where we talked about the sort of themes and insights that we got from it. And we used, for both of those instances, we used Copilot to first transcribe and record that conversation. So we got a set of notes, pull out a summary of the kind of key themes, and then we dropped that into our Copilot experiences and asked it to generate what are the sort of most important insights. And it gave us a paper that was like 80% of what we were really hoping to have. And then we just spent that last kind of 20% really tweaking it, refining those points, and coming up with our recommendations. And since then, sort of noticing that, I've brought that into all of the practices I have. I even will now, when I'm kind of driving home from work, join a Teams meeting just by myself and record it and transcribe that conversation just so I can kind of talk through a paper that I need to write or a presentation I need to put together and use that as the starting point then to generate an outline or the start of a presentation. And all of those kind of ins and outs of the normal flow of work, starting to create assets that then generative AI can leverage and help answer questions from, or give me a great starting point, a great first draft of a presentation or a topic. I found in my own work really save a ton of time and let me focus on the things that I care more about. And that's even before these tools are really sort of deeply integrated throughout Microsoft 365. These are just kind of point in time places right now. And as they get integrated more completely through our tools, connected to more and more backend systems, I can only imagine all of the sort of time savings and the ability to focus on the places where I can really uniquely add value that will be possible. So really excited.
Yeah, I mean, what you're describing is super interesting because you're sort of saying that there's this level of organization and orchestration that's starting to happen just automatically, right? So you're just talking to your empty meeting and it's sort of just organizing, what you sort of have as unstructured thoughts into something that's useful. The team meeting you had where now you're able to sort of generate a doc. That's all super interesting. You can imagine all the ways that, the products that Microsoft already have can be enhanced by it. But if you agree with that analogy, and it is kind of this organizing layer, how do you think that developers and third parties will be able to participate in that over time?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the work that goes on, especially in platforms like Microsoft 365, but really throughout all kinds of productivity applications, is about kind of connecting different systems, about sort of saying, hey, I've got this system of record over here and this tool for collaboration over there. And I want to write some code that glues these two things together and helps keep them in sync or helps people, again, be more productive or focus on what really matters. And I think what we see more and more when we look at technology like generative AI and sort of large language models, these foundational models that can, at their core, understand a lot of language, have a lot of logical reasoning built into them. If we can sort of take these different systems, these systems of record, systems of productivity and collaboration, and we can sort of describe them to large language models and to generative AI, and then allow them to sort of be the system integrator for you, to sort of take the natural language of any end user about how they'd like to connect those two things, and let that integrate the system together, and let then developers sort of focus on the system that they're building, and then describing that system in a way where it can be leveraged by these Copilot systems. That's a pretty magical world where then I have at my disposal, just by describing what I want, sort of a real-time ad hoc system integrator for me as an end user. And developers can then build out these incredibly powerful workflows just by focusing on those individual building blocks, and letting the power of these foundation models, this generative AI, really be the glue for those workflows between systems.
Yeah, do you think it changes the way software development is actually approached? Because my sense is that, in the past, you have to make a trade-off between using something best of breed that potentially does one thing really good. So you have a piece of software that it nails one scenario, but it's relatively disconnected from the rest of your stack, versus an end-to-end integrated experience that maybe is a little shallower on, the specific things. So do you feel like this represents the best of both worlds between those two? Do you see the coming down of the walled gardens as a result?
I mean, certainly when it's at its best, I think so. I think there are places where, even at Build, we demonstrated some scenarios where we're taking data from the Microsoft Graph. I think one of the scenarios sort of had a few turns with the Microsoft 365 Copilot, where I was asking about the web content management policies. What's the procedures for updating web content for Contoso?
Right.
And it answered that question by leveraging a whole bunch of disparate sources. So things that were coming from a third-party system, I think it was Confluence, through a graph connector, a whole bunch of information coming from SharePoint and the documents and communications stored in Microsoft 365 in the substrate. And then there was a really cool turn where it sort of then pulled back, okay, here's the synthesized procedure for how you update the Contoso website, and here's the next maintenance window for that. And then the next turn was to ask it to take that and create a Jira ticket to go do that, do those steps that were just described. And it was able to take an existing message extension that Jira created before Copilot even existed. That's essentially just a REST API and a kind of a declarative form built using adaptive cards. And Copilot then understands that form well enough to sort of look at the conversation and match up all the fields in that form and say, okay, here's the description for the task that needs to be created. Here's a suggested title. I even picked out the due date for the next maintenance window and inserted that as the due date into the form. And then, of course, users are in control. They have the opportunity to sort of look at all the confirmation that's going to happen there, all the action that's going to take place, and then confirm it. But that sort of idea that you can take a system like Jira to be your task tracking system, and even without it being explicitly integrated with Copilot or connected into these systems that have all the information about how to run this web content management system, just have the large language model be that glue based on a simple natural language query to say, create a Jira ticket based on this. That's pretty magical for me. And I think there's certainly a lot of challenges to solve to make that scalable and to have it apply to all sorts of different systems. But I think it then gives people the flexibility to choose whatever the right tool is for the task at hand, and then to know that they're going to have a system like Copilot that can connect that into whatever other tools that they want to use, using these sort of flexible integrations. So I do think that possibility exists, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you talk about flexibility, and clearly this solves for a lot of end user flexibility, right? They have different entry points. They can ask things in natural language, and it just sort of starts to be that glue as you described. But I'm also getting a sense there's a lot of flexibility on the developer side, which could be both a blessing and a curse. So like, I think we announced things around, natively like ChatGPT plugins will be able to be brought into 365. Or maybe you also have a Teams message extension or a Power Platform connector. So can you just help us understand the roadmap a little bit? If I'm a developer, where should I start? Should I build a ChatGPT plugin and bring it in? Should I build something more bespoke for the 365 Copilot system? What's the lay of the land?
Yeah, absolutely. You nailed it up front, which is we really are trying to meet developers where they are. And so we announced that we'll support plugins in M365 Copilot that are the same format as the ones built for ChatGPT, which is essentially like an open API or a Swagger document that describes a REST endpoint and how it works semantically. I mean, you're really kind of just using natural language to describe how to call this endpoint, and then the large language model is able to do it, which is really cool stuff.
Wow, that's cool.
We're also then supporting in a forward compatible way existing M365 and Teams technologies like message extensions. So if a developer's already built, like Jira, the Jira example, if you've already built a message extension that allows you to integrate with chat with humans, then we can apply that same technology. It's again a REST API with a semantic description. In this case, even a form and a declarative UX on top of it. And again, the large language model can understand the shape of that API and the intent based on that description in that declarative form. And it can support it in the same way as an open API plugin. So if you're already building plugins for ChatGPT, you'll be able to bring those without modification. You can essentially take the exact same definition, plop it in a Teams manifest, and go through the same sorts of developer tooling you'll use to go build Teams in order to publish it, in order to test it out, and then submit it the same way you'll support any other Teams app. If you're already building a Teams integration, you can bring a whole bunch of the technology you have used there, whether that's a bot that you've built that you want to now refresh and renew and sort of make more modern by leveraging large language models to have more flexible interaction, or it's a message extension that you want to be able to use not just in kind of human chats and link unfurling and email, but you also want to use as part of interactions with Copilot. Those will just sort of work. And then, of course, you can add to them and tune them and continue to invest in them to have all of those, regardless of which path you started from, sort of realize all of the potential integration points throughout Microsoft 365.
Wow. And then, so how would it work, though, in terms of what these plugins can access? Are they all going to use the same like foundation model? Are you able to bring your own? Is that a organization makes that decision? How does that work?
So we've got this option to bring your own foundation models and integrate with the UX of Microsoft 365. You can also use Microsoft 365 Copilot. So you can essentially use our foundation models deployed in the compliance boundary in Microsoft 365. So they have the same sorts of promises that all of the other functionality in Microsoft 365 has in terms of customer security, compliance, privacy, all of those things. And those foundation models then are encapsulating experiences across Microsoft 365, these Microsoft 365 Copilot experiences, cross-app experiences that will show up in Teams and Microsoft 365 and Bing, and then embedded experiences that understand kind of how to command and interact with the context of the app inside of Word, Excel, PowerPoint, Outlook, and Teams. And those will bring their own foundation model with them. They'll bring sort of our foundation model deployed in Microsoft 365 in a way that's sort of consistent with all those enterprise promises. But those models themselves are actually a little bit separate than from customer data, or sort of fully separate from customer data, in that they're still models that were trained on public data in the same way that a general instance of GPT-3 or GPT-4 would be. And the process of sort of bringing in customer data and bringing in these plugins is done through what we generally refer to as grounding. So this is the idea that when a user gives us a prompt, before we sort of just hand that prompt over to GPT, we actually ask it to start to analyze what context it might want in order to best address that prompt. And that can include things like making a query into the Microsoft Graph or activating one of these plugins. And then that's sort of done iteratively with processing of the prompt. So, if you were to ask about a meeting coming up, or a topic that is something that I'm actively working on, generally speaking, we'd go into the Microsoft Graph and we'd act on behalf of that user in the same way we would any sort of search query. We'd apply the same sorts of filters in terms of permission, in terms of privacy, in terms of security, in terms of information management, so that it can only access the things that it's intended to access. And then we pull back all of that information and context, and we sort of hand it to that model, that foundation model, again, sort of deployed or trained only on really that sort of public data at this point. And it would then have, for the context of that query, all the information it needs to answer it, pulled from the graph in a way that's very consistent with the way we treat things like search or Microsoft Graph Access. So it has that same sort of set of controls and guardrails that all of those existing features do. And we get to leverage a bunch of the work around security and compliance that's already been done to this new model as well.
And would the third-party developer in this case retain any of that grounding information? Would any of that be stored or sent to them? Or what is the level of abstraction there?
It doesn't really change. So it's the sort of the same level of abstraction that already exists. So if I have a message extension for Jira, let's use that example again. So if I'm creating a Jira ticket and I'm doing it as a part of a conversation, I will, in the context of that conversation, activate that message extension. That message extension knows a little bit about the context. So it can, for example, figure out sort of who the person invoking it is, so it can trim security appropriately and kind of understand the context of that conversation. But then the user is really in control of the action that's actually performed. So in the case of that Jira ticket, the context is pulled from the conversation by the large language model. It's mapped to the fields of that form. And only when that form is submitted, after the user sort of looks through whatever has been put into that form, make sure it's all correct and adjusts it to their liking, and then hit submit, it's only that information that really goes off to the third party. The same as if the user had typed it in manually as a part of that conversation. So it's really trying to leverage all of the same boundaries for access to Microsoft 365 data, for what data is shared with third parties and what goes off to third party systems as well.
Yeah. So I want to ask a final question. It's a little more speculative. So obviously, conversational interface is just kind of taking the world by storm, right? If you look at how much ChatGPT is being used, what's your speculation on how the UX paradigm will evolve over time? Because I've seen, at this point, a couple hundred LinkedIn articles about how to write the best prompts for X or Y. Do you feel like the future is where just people get really good at writing these prompts, or do you think the UX is going to continue to evolve such that barrier to entry is lowered?
Yeah, I mean, I think UX will continue to evolve both on the sort of input side, how you generate prompts, and on the way that responses come in. So, you talked about, for example, all of these articles about how to write the best prompts and sort of refine prompts. And I think that will be a skill that more and more people will just develop, is sort of understanding how to interact with these foundation models in ways that get them the results they want. It's really cool to sort of look at all the communities that have sprung up where people are sort of sharing prompts that have worked with them and building on one another's work there. And I think that's a testament to both the sort of flexibility and depth of the technology, but also the need to really sort of play with it and understand how to get the most out of it. So I think there's an opportunity there for the UX of these experiences to help guide users to it, both to get the best use out of it. But even I think a lot of people, when they first start to interact with something like ChatGPT, are maybe not quite understanding the breadth of what it can do. And for a lot of people, there's that kind of aha moment when there's that first unexpected thing that it's able to do that you didn't really think of. And I think helping users kind of understand that one is another part of the UX paradigm. How do we start to sort of guide people towards those magical aha moments where they really sort of expand their perspective on what it's capable of doing? So I do think that there's a lot of opportunity on the front end to continue iterating. I also think in the responses, there's a lot of opportunity, especially when it comes to things like plugins. One of my colleagues likes to note, the concept of a form was invented long before computers. Once we had sort of language between humans, it was still useful to be able to say, okay, here are the different fields you can fill out and the sort of semantic labels that go on each one of them. And when you look at some of the experiences that you get from plugins today, there's lots of opportunity to say, oh, if I'm integrating with something like Expedia, can you give me something better than just sort of text that shows me all of the listings? We've built up entire web ecosystems about much better user experiences for sort of picking from a set of potential vacation rentals to go and book. So I do think in the responses as well, there's going to be a lot of opportunity to continue iterating on that user experience to sort of show people in easier to consume and understand ways the information that's coming back. That's not always just pure text. In order to then support multiple turns, so you can interact with those entities that come back as well. And I think there's a lot in the platform already that we can start to leverage to do that. Things like adaptive cards are a great starting point. But I think it's also one where the industry is going to make a ton of progress over the next few years on continuing to evolve. And the flexibility that something like just a pure open API description gives you is great and is awesome as a starting point. But then sort of layering on top of that the ability to have things like confirmation of actions and a more complex representation of an entity that helps you really understand it in a way that just sort of basic text won't. I think there's lots of opportunities there too.
Yeah, it's very interesting to think about the system itself creating even more engagement with your app, just as the responses start to become interesting and start to invite the next action in more of an automatic way, and not having the developer to not necessarily have to think about that anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. And it turns out that because many of these foundation models, certainly GPT included, know how to write code, it can actually do a whole bunch of this work for you. So GPT is pretty darn good at understanding and generating adaptive cards. And so if you in your prompt ask it to give you a response, but to give you a response as an adaptive card, you can kind of already change interactions in that way and ask it to sort of represent things using a declarative UX, adaptive cards or otherwise. And it's really cool to see just how capable those foundation models are in understanding all those various languages and sort of breaking down the boundaries between natural language and sort of more declarative UX kind of concepts like adaptive cards. So I think that'll go fast. I think this will be one of those places where a year from now it looks very different from the sorts of interactions that are kind of standard today.
Yeah, I completely agree. Well, what an inspiring place to end. Obviously, Rob and I have only had a chance to talk about this at the highest level. There's a lot more information online. One of the places that we do want to send you is a blog post that was written on the subject coming out of Build. You can reach that at aka.ms/plugins_for_M365 Copilot. Rob, thanks so much for your time. This was a great conversation. It's great to just feel the energy and sort of enthusiasm you have for the subject. It's definitely contagious. So thank you again.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.